Bon après-midi tout le monde et bienvenue à cette annonce relative à la tarification du carbone. Good afternoon everyone and welcome to today's announcement on carbon pricing. Le porte-parole aujourd'hui est le Premier ministre Blaine Higgs. Speaking on behalf of the province today is Premier Blaine Higgs. Avant de céder la parole au Premier ministre, voulez-vous assurer de désactiver le son de vos micros? Before I turn things over to Premier Higgs, I would like to ask everyone to ensure your microphones are placed on mute. Premier.
Merci, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. As you may recall, we, from the very beginning, didn't believe the carbon tax was a solution. And we argued against it during the campaign, and we argued, but unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in avoiding its implementation. As we said from the very beginning, the federal carbon tax has and will continue to result in higher prices for everything. And notwithstanding the crisis we've seen in Europe, the carbon tax has indeed brought additional costs of everything we buy every day, in addition to our traveling expenses. But in the situation we're in right now, and in making the best choices for citizens of the New Brunswick, it's important for us to look at how it's being implemented and should we be making changes.
However, we only need to make choices that are in the best interest of the people of New Brunswick. Things have changed very much since 2020, when we presented our own plan regarding the carbon tax.
A made in New Brunswick carbon tax plan that took our province's own unique circumstances into consideration. And our plan worked and was accepted by the federal government. It allowed us to provide tax reductions and to invest in climate change initiatives. In fact, every dime that we collected from the carbon tax went into one of those categories. However, there's no room for negotiation when it comes to the federal requirements moving forward on the carbon tax from 23 to 20. À l'automne, le gouvernement fédéral a annoncé qu'il
In the fall, the federal government announced that it would implement the federal backstop in the other Atlantic provinces and provide rebate checks to the residents of these provinces.
in mind, we have reevaluated our position on the carbon tax, and we intend to align ourselves with our Atlantic neighbors and other provinces across the country by opting into the federal backstop, which we communicated to the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change earlier today. Our goal with this change is the same as it has been, and it is especially more relevant today with the high costs that everyone is experiencing. We know that recently, and especially over the last few months, New Brunswickers have been feeling the impacts of inflation and are struggling with the higher prices on everything from food to fuel. By changing our approach, we can help New Brunswickers get money back into their pockets in the form of a quarterly rebate checks from the federal government. We do not know exactly how much New Brunswickers will receive. That decision will be made by the federal government, but it's based on the total amount of carbon tax paid in the province. I can say that as a comparison point for 23-24, a family of four in Nova Scotia is estimated to receive an annualized payment of $992. In PEI, that amount is estimated to be in the range of $960. We expect New Brunswickers' rebate to be in a similar range. At the same time, New Brunswickers will also continue to benefit from our previous commitments, such as legislative tax reductions and climate change initiatives that are currently underway. And that will be providing approximately $200 million in continued support. Même si nous ne percevons,
Even if we won't be getting the tax at the provincial level, I don't want people to believe that we will be stepping back regarding climate change.
committed to fighting climate change and investing in ways that we can continue to meet emission reductions in many different ways. And that was based on our climate action plan that was released last September. But we'll continue to act on opportunities where we can do so to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions target by 2030 and to continue on the path for 2050. Thank you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Premier. Thank you, Premier. We will now have 30 minutes for questions from members of the media. Each reporter will have question, and if time permits, we will cycle back for a second question. You have the right to pose your question in the official language of your choice. Nous avons 30 minutes pour les questions des membres des médias. Chaque journaliste aura une question et si le temps permet, on va faire des suivis. Vous avez le droit de poser votre question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. We'll now start with Jacques Poitras, CBC.
I'm going to try 1.5 questions. So the 2 years of income tax cuts and the gas tax cut will remain in place. Those don't go back to the previous 2019 levels.
No. At this time, we will continue those where they are.
Change take effect? July 1st. July 1st. And so what's the carbon tax we'll be paying from April 1st to July 1st?
In the order of 11 cents.
It won't go up to the next one.
Our plan is not to raise it because it's not raised in other provinces. And we will have the 11 cents, so we have to keep that on. But in July 1st, where other provinces will, particularly Nova Scotia, will be going up probably 14 cents or something in that range, we will go up 3 cents.
Alex Villeneuve, Radio-Canada.
I would like to take this opportunity to do a follow-up. In fact, you said in November that you wanted to have a fund for people who need help and use the part of the carbon tax. What will happen with this fund that was dedicated to help people who with the erosion along the coasts, and what will happen with this project?
Well, it's a good question because in the sense of we will continue to use on the relief fund, that part will be what the carbon tax is going to be used for, and it'll be in quarterly checks that will now be federally administrated. The other areas that we were using the carbon tax for was very much erosion along coastlines and where we'd seen climate action, raising highways, putting in bigger culverts. The action plans that we had that will continue are the ones we have for the heat pump program and other energy savings programs. So it will have an impact. We'll have to look at each area that has experienced a significant erosion, and I know that's one of them, because we will continue to have a climate fund to deal with. It just might not be as robust as it would have been because we were using it in its entirety. But we will still have a climate fund. I think we had in the order of 37 million before. Whether we can do better than that or not, I'm not sure, but we will continue to focus on climate items.
Thank you much. Silas Brown, Global TV.
So I guess why go forward with this now? Because when you initially said, okay, this clearly New Brunswickers are in favor of this, or the majority at least voted for it in that federal election, we're going to make the New Brunswick one the best that it can be for New Brunswickers, and you've provided tax cuts and things like that. Why not continue down that path and go towards this path? And is it that you believe that New Brunswickers will receive more money through this program than they would through tax cuts?
Well, I guess it's that impression of cash in hand. So every quarter, family would get a check, family of four would get a check of, let's say, $200, $250. And our neighbors, of course, all around us now are doing that because they've accepted the backstop. So is it the best plan to reduce, cost of living in the province of long haul, to reduce the overall and put money into projects that are really going to reduce emissions or reduce or mitigate the impact of climate change? I would say what we were doing was that best plan. But what we're doing now is based on the real, more or less, community requirement that, look, my neighbors are getting a check, why aren't we getting a check? Well, we can't do both. So we're in 7 provinces, I think now it'll be 8, have accepted the backstop. And the message is they're all getting checks personally, and that's what the people of this province feel that why can't we have the same?
Thank you. Allison Sampson, CTV.
Going a little off script, but what's your opinion on the payout for Dr. John Dornish?
Well, it's still under, I guess, I haven't had the report from the legal side yet of next steps. But I guess the only point I would make to that is, as we've recently, and we're continuing to see improvements in the healthcare system. And, when I made decisions back in July, It was to bring a sense of urgency into the healthcare system that, you know, we have a crisis all across the country, and we need to find a streamlined way to make it happen. So that involved, I know, a lot of people and the boards and such, but if I had to go back in July, I would be doing the same thing.
Thank you. Andrew Wall with Brunswick News Post Media.
Thanks, Bruce. Premier, so you said you just said you'd go back and do the same thing. The adjudicator agreed with Dr. Dornan's assertion that you fired him in a disingenuous and callous manner. Saying you would have done exactly the same thing, or maybe you would have treated his termination in a less public and perhaps more gentle fashion.
Well, I don't think, I wasn't talking about what the adjudicator had said and whether that was right or wrong, those comments that were made by the adjudicator. I was referring to the overall situation and the changes that were made. So I think the statements made, the decision made are still to be evaluated, and that I'll wait for our legal folks to give me a determination on that.
Thank you. Alexandre Boudreau avec l'Acadie Nouvelle.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Going back to the carbon tax, you have mentioned that the reductions of taxes that you put in place will remain. And I'm trying to understand, in fact, where these revenues will come from your general funds, or how will this cost to the province of New Brunswick each year? Could you remind us?
It'll be from general funds, and it'll be about a $200 million hit on that. It's, I guess, had we had our choice from the beginning, we would have never put a carbon tax on to begin with. But we didn't have that choice. So now I'm kind of in a position where I've committed to tax reductions. I've committed to some of the projects on the climate change program because I had a climate or funds related to the carbon tax. So now that I no longer have that capability, we will look at projects. As I stated earlier, we'll look at projects and we'll prioritize projects. We just won't necessarily have the same amount of revenue to manage them.
Thank you. Mike Landry with All New Brunswick.
Premier, a bit of a two-part question. I'm wondering if there was any consultation with industry prior to making this decision and what their feedback was. Of course, you're talking about cash in hand for the average taxpayer. It's a little bit different for big emitters and things like that. The other side of the coin, along with industrial users, are MB Power. I know for MB Power's planning, they were betting all their sort of computation had to do with the carbon pricing system that existed, which was lower. It looks like, I'm just not sure if you know whether this new backstop will further compound problems for MB Power when it comes to carbon pricing and emissions.
Well, I think it's my understanding that what we're talking about here is only the carbon tax. The output-based pricing model that's in place was accepted. The Clean Fuel Standards Act, which is still being negotiated in many ways, there's still some issues there to be resolved, particularly as it relates to New Brunswick. But the output-based pricing that would affect MB Power, I believe, will be unaffected by this change.
Thank you.
Okay, and in terms of consulting with industry?
Yeah, well, there's no real impact. That's my point. So there isn't an impact. Yeah.
Thank you. Erica Butler with CHMA Sackville.
Hi there, Premier Higgs. I'm wondering if you can give a little insight as to why it is that you feel the carbon tax is not a useful tool in the fight against climate change or in the fight to change people's fuel habits. Just wondering if you can speak a bit to the philosophy behind that, why it is you disagree with that, because it seems like a fairly straightforward sort of price incentive.
Well, if you think about where we are right now, our argument we put forward in light of the situation in Europe was that the prices of fuel had gotten to a point without the carbon tax that exceeded what was intended to be with the carbon tax in place. So you would argue that, okay, we've already reached a level that will impact consumption because that was what the carbon tax was going to do. But there was no ability to have a negotiation or discussion with the federal government to say, look, recognize the impact this is having on citizens. We're seeing increased costs everywhere. Everyone is telling us how much our groceries, we're all seeing it at the groceries, we're all seeing it not only for energy supply, but everything we buy, we're seeing increased costs. And that can be narrowed right down into the cost of transportation, the cost of fuel for heating, that gets these commodities to our stores. So our argument was you've already arrived at the number you intended to get with the carbon tax. You could take the carbon tax off at this high time of inflation. People would still have a disincentive because fuel prices are higher than they've ever been. But there was no willingness to even address it. So then you say, okay, what is the real motive here? Because people are hurting. So we were taking the carbon tax and making the full use of it to make it cheaper for everyone, but also to use it for climate action programs. So now it's a case where, no, okay, well, we would rather, and the backstop is simply a recycle program of 90% of the revenue generated. So it's kind of a bureaucratic program to send everything to Ottawa, 10% overhead to administer it, and then send it all back, and then distribute it to every household. So you kind of say, what is the motive for all of that? I mean, if you tried to lower the cost initially for people without doing all that, because you've already achieved the level of fuel expense. So that's my point. We had, let's just say we'd already had achieved the target and beyond of what the carbon tax was supposed to do to expenses. So now it continues being implemented, even though the checks come back. The cost we are spending for fuel, for all the commodities we purchase, will exceed the actual cost people are expending every day to live and work in this province.
Thank you. Robert Fisher, St. Croix Courier.
Thank you. The carbon tax rebate is one component of fuel prices. The Atlantic provinces are the only ones in the country that have fuel price regulation. New Brunswick has for several months, many months, had some of the highest fuel prices in the country. Is fuel price regulation the appropriate way to price fuel for market consumption?
Well, the reason that that was put in place and judged off of the market in New York Harbor was based on having a comparator there that reflected market conditions with what we pay here in the province. So that's why it was brought in place to begin with, because of the pricing comparators that we saw in New Brunswick with higher prices than what was anticipated should be, and as a result, having a method to control that. So that was brought in place to control the variability, the movements in pricing, and to control a differential that made sense. So that's why it's there, and I mean, that was the reason. So have the reasons changed that would bring that in place, let's say an open market situation? Maybe. I'm not sure. I know we see a big differential with the US, we always have. We shouldn't have this differential with Nova Scotia, because that was primarily, we had a carbon tax formula that worked. But they will see that differential close and beyond in the July 1st. It might be worth evaluating, again, the value of, the pricing formula we have here, and does it work for New Brunswick still? But I know why it was originally put in, and these are unique times, unique circumstances. I'm not convinced it would improve any, but I'm always willing to look at it. And I have questioned the tax formula. I've questioned, why our prices in New Brunswick seem to be higher, and is there something we could do about it? So I don't disagree with the logic and should we question it?
Thank you. Steve McKinley, Toronto Star.
Thanks. I've had my question answered already.
Thanks, Steve. Barb Simpson with Brunswick News Post Media.
Hi there. I just have a question of clarification. So will the provincial gas tax still be lowered, I guess, by 4 cents, despite the loss of this the plan?
Well, it'll still be lowered. If you're thinking back to when we reduced it initially, if you recall, when it was first put in place at 4 cents or 5 cents increase, we reduced our tax, our gas tax by the same amount. Well, I kind of got ridiculed for that it wasn't part of the program. I couldn't do that because I would have kept doing that. And I would have had a break even situation. So I couldn't keep doing that. But at this point, are we going to raise it back up even though we no longer control the carbon tax? That is not our plan. Our plan is to continue with a tax rate lowered by 5 cents on the gas tax that we put in place at the beginning.
Thank you. Michel Corriveau, Radio-Canada.
Michel Corriveau, Radio-Canada. Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Premier. Yesterday, First Nations, the Mi'kmaq First Nations, have announced that land claims were talking about 60% of the province of New Brunswick. What do you think of that?
I was expecting it, so it didn't come as a surprise as such. The overlap is kind of interesting to see that the similar parts or same pieces of New Brunswick are being claimed by two different groups. So I guess that brings an interesting dilemma or dynamic to the whole process. So I haven't had any kind of legal interpretation of where we go next, but I would assume that this will fall into the same evaluation and determination of the treaty rights that we've been undertaking with Louis Tegui.
Thank you very much. Some time still permits, so we'll try and cycle back for a second one. Il reste encore un peu de temps. On va essayer de aller à la deuxième question. Jacques Poitras, CBC.
So you're saying with the loss of all this revenue, the climate fund won't be as robust, but I mean, the two income tax cuts mean a lot more than just the climate fund amount. Like we're talking, I think by my math, almost 150 million and maybe more. So do you have to cut something to account for that lost revenue, or do your big surpluses give you a cushion to kind of just sort of give up that revenue? Like what?
Well,
what's
the tax,
Yeah.
the tax breaks were in the order of 128 million, I think 130 million, but we're not going to roll those back. We're going to keep them as they are. There's no question. It bites into the overall surplus that we currently have, and the question is, I guess, how long will that surplus be maintained, or what kind of level of revenue are we going to see over the coming months or years? So at this point in time, we would say, all right, we'll build current expenses that we've had last year into our budget going forward, and we won't roll back on those, and we'll see where that goes. Yep.
Monsieur Villeneuve, as-tu une deuxième question?
Would you have a second question? Yes. Do you know already, in fact, if you have heard if the federal government is open, that did you discuss with the federal government regarding how people feel about the situation?
Yes, we've had discussions about, in-depth discussions about, do we need a carbon tax at this point in time? We've had discussions about us moving to a backstop, and I think they expected that would happen given the situations in the other province, particularly when all Atlantic provinces lined up and basically took the backstop. We were in I would say, a unique position one way, because our folks in environment did an excellent job negotiating with the federal governments on not only where we landed on carbon tax and such and how it was being implemented, but more so on the output-based pricing, the clean fuel standards, and working with them. So we had a fully accepted carbon plan. And then going forward as we're looking for reduction. So we were well ahead of the curve in terms of gas emissions and reducing emissions overall. And we're at about 70%, maybe in that range, a little better, of carbon-free generation now, because we have a very diversified power system. So, we were in pretty good shape to meet our standards, and we're focused on what to do with Baldoon, the only coal-fired plant we have. Nova Scotia has 4 coal-fired plants. And we were focused, and that's where the gas discussion comes into play, because we actually could reduce emissions by 25, 30, maybe even 35% in Atlantic Canada in this interim period. But we are where we are now with the federal government, and they know we're bringing this in place, and we've informed them, and they've agreed.
Merci. Silas Brown, Global.
Every time that we've talked to the finance minister recently, he's said that there are storm clouds on the horizon, that the current large budgetary surpluses that we've seen in the last couple of years aren't expected to continue, that those revenues will eventually soften. So if that happens in the next couple of years, as your government seems to be expecting, this is give or take $200 million of spending, basically, that you're announcing today. What happens to those tax cuts if those revenues start to slacken? Will you commit to New Brunswickers that as long as you're premier, you wouldn't up those taxes or reverse those tax cuts that you put in place?
Well, I don't think that I've really ever taken a position much in terms of what ifs or hypothetically what could happen. I think at the time, we'd have to make a decision. Okay, what does this mean for what we're having? The minister is correct that all indications are our revenue that we've enjoyed the last couple of years is not going to be a sustained revenue. But we don't know that. I mean, we've seen increases in HST because people are buying more. Inflation and prices are costing us more too. A big part of our capital budget, about 25%, was increased costs. But we kept the same budget, just the same projects. We just added more money into it. So where that's going to go down the road, what I'm trying to avoid is what has been a trap that we've seen provinces get into in the past, is either spending money that you can't be sure of or spend it before you ever have it. And so I've been very cautious not to do that. Even in the two elections, we didn't do that. And that's why we balance the budget each and every year. And we'll continue to balance the budget. But if our revenue, right now, the projections are, we'll balance the budget based on what our projections are. And we'll just have to see where that goes, because we will make decisions as required to maintain a balanced position.
Thank you. Andrew Waugh, Brunswick News Post Media.
So, Premier, you've now been engaged in two very high-profile disputes with doctors. The province is trying to recruit and retain new physicians, and you've acknowledged it's a worldwide fight. Is there any concern here that what you've done in these very high-profile dismissals and comments could affect that ability to attract people? Do you think doctors want to come and work here?
Well, I guess, Andrew, in terms of engaging in significant discussions, I always like to have all of the details shared on the rationale behind it, whether it be with the medical, in the medical system, or whether it be in education, whether it be in First Nations. I guess the thing that I've been very consistent on is that if I feel there's an opportunity to improve the overall conditions of our citizens' service to citizens, be it in healthcare, be it education, our overall well-being of all people living here in New Brunswick. If I feel there's an opportunity, I don't look for roadblocks to prevent that opportunity from appearing. I look for a way to achieve that opportunity for the people I'm working for, and that's the citizens of the province. So sometimes that involves tough discussions. But when you put all the facts on the table, and over the years in many negotiations, you can have a very big disagreement on what you'd like to see and what you want to change. But at the end of the day, you all have to figure out, okay, well, what's the best thing? And in this case, it's what's the best thing for the citizens of the province? What gives us the best health care in New Brunswick? What gives us the best education? Let's put aside the personalities and the conflict, the personal conflicts, and say, how do we deliver better results? I just stick with that principle, and so it does involve sometimes some tough discussions.
Thank you. Alexandre Boudreau, l'Acadie Nouvelle.
Oui, Monsieur le Premier.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. Premier, I'm trying to understand your decision regarding the carbon tax. What you have mentioned is that really you're afraid that people from other provinces would receive checks, and here it would be different. Are you afraid of the backlash from the citizens? Could you explain to us your decision?
We have been constantly, said, well, what are we going to do to fight inflation? What are we going to do to help people who have suddenly seen an inflationary cost that they didn't experience 2 years ago? We can look at this in terms of in history, and I remember going through inflationary times where we had 15% interest and even as high as 20% interest for mortgage renewals back in the early 80s. So the 5%, 6%, 7% even, isn't traditionally a big issue, but it has been based on the last 10 years of very, very low interest rates. So mortgages were signed up to low interest rates and people were accustomed to that. So now we're transitioning. That may very well be a higher inflation rate as people transition to high values in their homes, higher mortgage rates, and then we have to kind of work through that. So what this does right now is provide relief for those folks that, I would rather see no carbon tax at all on our fuel, on your heating oil, on your fuel for purchasing and gas and diesel, because it's affecting the bottom line of everything else. So it's kind of everything else goes up because of one of the major contributors to costs, which is transportation. So had I had a choice, that would have been the choice. But I don't have that choice. So given that, it's like, okay, how do we get relief to people who want it right now in their homes at a time when inflation is higher than they've experienced, maybe in their lifetime? So this will do that. This will put it directly into the hands of those folks that really say, I would rather have the money because I need it for my home.
Thank you. Mike Landry, all New Brunswick.
Yeah, I'd return to the idea of this, that carbon tax isn't really a good method. In your view, I was just looking at the JDI logistics ESG report from this past year, and they say that the exact opposite, that it's because of these carbon pricing, including retail fuel tax, that's pushing it towards green initiatives right now. I'm just wondering, how else would we go about, or would you like to see large consumers like that shift? JDI is now considering wind on its forests. I don't know if they would do that if the carbon pricing wasn't there. I guess, how would you get to that point?
I'm not saying the opposite. I'm not saying the opposite at all. In fact, what I said was we were using the carbon tax, one, to offset costs to individuals, secondly, for climate action items. And they were going directly to that. I mean, the heat pump to reduce our consumption in electricity by maybe 20% or 25% wouldn't have happened without the carbon tax. But we did it, and we put it there to reduce for the same reason the JDI argument you're using, very same logic. So my point is here. Now we won't be using it for that. We won't have the same volume of dollars for that because those dollars are now being taken back and distributed throughout the province. So is every individual in the country, in the province, going to use it for the same reason? Are they going to put it towards reducing the consumption of their energy in their home? That is the issue. So the JDI formula is exactly what I believed in here, and is why we took the carbon tax and we distributed it, portion of it, and for return, and a portion of it, a significant portion, which would continue to grow in climate action and climate emissions or energy use reduction programs.
Thank you. Ms. Butler, do you have a quick question?
Sure. I will ask one more just related to Dr. Dornan. You've referred to sort of quick dramatic action on healthcare, and that seems to include the sudden firing of the Horizon CEO. As far as I can see right now, though, since then, everything that Horizon has been doing and their successes, it all seem to be in things that were underway under Dr. John Dornan. So I guess I'm wondering if you can point to a policy or a sticking point that caused you to see the firing of that CEO as something, as dramatic action that would improve healthcare.
Well, I think you should maybe meet with the CEOs and the trustees and understand what has evolved with them over the last 6 months. That would probably be a better way to answer this question, because then you could see further.
Okay, Horizon seems to be, reporting on programs that were already underway under Dornan. So I guess that's what I'm asking for. What has changed?
We've had a lot of programs underway in health for many, many years. You could go back to studies that were done on just about everything for a long time. And so the point is, there's a sense of urgency now, more so than ever, to make sure that these projects get across the line. But you can go back 10, 15, 20 years and find programs that have been underway. Because if there's one thing that's constant, is a program being under study, under review, coming soon. We're looking at it, we're thinking about it. But what we're trying to achieve is the results that people can feel. And if I want to point to a couple of those, I would point to the cataract surgery up in Bathurst and a 70% reduction in wait times. If we've started a program because we have about 700 people that are behind in the hip and knee surgery, and we're trying to get down to a national average. It should be in the 6-month range, maybe a year at max, and we're targeting to do that. I've said that we will put money into any aspect of healthcare where results are imminent and actually happening for citizens, and we will continue to do that. But it has to demonstrate that citizens are going to see the result. We've reduced the wait times on the list right now, or access, I should say, to primary care from 75,000 to 55,000, with a goal right now, of that continually to improve through a multiple of efforts. So, but I do encourage you to meet with the CEO of Horizon and Vitality and to see firsthand the progress they are making in real terms, because that's when you can have an appreciation for action items that may have been thought about in Horizon or Vitality for a long, long time, but they're actually making traction on them.
Dernière question, last question goes to Robert Fisher with St. Croix Courier.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Okay, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone.